Mr. Campbell.
I thank you very much. You know, in politics these days, we want to do everything in sound bites, and we want to come up with a solution for every problem. This issue, income inequality, mobility limitation, joblessness, whatever thing you want to deal with, is extremely complex and multifaceted and international, as many of you have mentioned. It doesn't lend itself well to that, and I think we do it a disservice when we do that, or do the problem a disservice when we try to say it can be solved with a single thing or a single solution. I also think we do it a disservice if we use it to further divide America. If people bring it up and try and say that it is somebody against somebody else, whenever that is used, it not only does a disservice to the country, but does a disservice to solving the issue. The third problem I think we have with this, which I'm hearing on this panel, frankly, not there, here, well, to some degree there, is if we use this issue to simply justify the policies that one party or the other have advocated for decades, we're not being serious, and we're also not looking for a real solution. We are simply using the issue to justify the things we already believe, and that perhaps the other side doesn't believe. So I think when we do any of those things, we are being counterproductive towards, and I think the issue is too important. I think it is too significant to trivialize it and reduce it in that manner. Now, that being said, in the 5 minutes of this soundbite, I can't engage in a thorough discussion, but I will say I heard some interesting things that we haven't discussed much. Secretary Rice, you mentioned about vocational and technical trade and educational conceit. I don't think that's necessarily something where either party has staked out ground where they can't move. Dr. Kearney, you mentioned about devolution of the family and social issues. Those are difficult, I understand. They're emotional, they involve other things, but they can't be ignored. And one way or the other, people need to discuss it. One thing I wanted to bring up is whether, you know, when I spent much more of my life in the private sector than in public, and I never worried about how much somebody else made as long as I was making what I felt I ought to earn. When you look at the top incomes these days, and I'm not going to go into either business people or into entertainment because that politicizes it. So I always like to bring up sports because that tends to depoliticize the thing. And if you look at any major sport today, the players in those sports make way, way more money, adjusted for inflation and anything else, than they did in the 60s and prior. And you talk to people who were huge names at those eras, and they'll say, well, you know, I got out just before the really big salaries came up, the really big income. That, by the way, will apply to team owners as well in some of what they do and what these teams are worth. Why is that? Dr. Kearney,
sure.
Anybody?
No, thank you for your serious attention to this very difficult and nuanced problem. I think a focus on the top 1% and why those folks have, you know, such enormous wages and incomes it's a fascinating question. In some senses, it's an academic question. Why has it become okay in a question of norms for a CEO to make so much more?
Keep it to sports, please.
Right. So the sports. Now we have a global television market. The revenues to these sports franchises are larger, and so some would argue that they're earning it because of the value brought into the sports team and the TV licenses, et cetera. But I do want to say, this, I think, distracts us from the real policy question. Those are fun questions to talk about, right? But the bigger issue, and the one that we need to do something about, is the inequality between people. College workers make twice as much as those with a high school degree. We could do something about that.
So is what you're saying is we should ignore that? Well, unfortunately, this thing is focused. A lot of people focus on those,
of course,
on the picture that
so
gets the $240 million.
It's huge,
but it distracts from the real issue, does it not?
I would tend to agree. Okay,
my time's up. Thank you.
Vice Chairman Klobuchar, appreciate hearing all of your testimony today. Let me ask you this.
Well, first of all, we all know that the essence of the American dream is economic mobility and opportunity to succeed. There's no doubt about that. And by most measures, Americans are better off today than they have been in past decades. And there's still a significant opportunity for all individuals, low-income individuals, all-income individuals, to move up the economic ladder. I want to focus some of my comments as well on education, because a couple of you touched in particular on that as part of your testimony, and particularly the skill upgrading concept you mentioned, Dr. Kearney. Information technology has boosted the marginal productivity of highly skilled and college-educated workers. This has caused the real wages paid to these workers to increase more rapidly over time as the demand for them grew more rapidly than the supply. And at the same time, information technology directly competes with some generally less skilled and less educated workers, causing those real wages then to stagnate. And economists have called this phenomenon skill-based technological change and estimated that it could account for a majority of the increase in income inequality both in the United States and around the world. Dr. Kearney, I'll just start with you. Would you agree that skill-based technological change is a major cause of income inequality, not only in the United States, but in other countries as well?
Yes, I am firmly in the camp among labor economists who subscribe to this notion of skill-biased technological change. But it's a nuanced view. The computerization and information technology has certainly accentuated and the skills in a positive way, increased the returns to skills for the higher educated. But in the most recent decade, in the 90s, in contrast to the 80s, it actually did have some positive effects on the earnings of the lowest skilled. So, or I should say, folks in the service sector, truck drivers have better GPS systems, for example. And where it's really hurt is right at the middle. Okay, so, and those are blue-collar and white-collar jobs that are more easy to automate, for example. Those are the jobs that have gotten hit by this skill-biased technological change. To Chairman Brady's earlier question, I will say that while I believe that skill-biased technological change and essentially the supply and demand of skills are the primary drivers of our patterns of income inequality, there is strong evidence that the erosion of the minimum wage during the 1980s contributed to the decline in low wages at the bottom during the 80s. Now, of course, in the 90s, as I mentioned, those wages rebounded without a coterminous increase in the minimum wage.
Hey, Dr. Kearney, would you also say that education would be the most effective long-term solution to that growing gap between skills employers that they seek and the skills that workers actually have?
Yes, it's a focused education. It's a smart education. It's an education that is committed to STEM education, right? And educating and training the students for the jobs of today's global economy.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. One of the interesting aspects of discussions about the economy or income inequality inside the Beltway, as opposed to back home in the real world, is the very different tone that we hear. The idea that anybody could suggest that we are not seeing massive increases in income and wealth inequality is beyond my comprehension. If you go outside of the Beltway, there is no debate about that. The idea that anyone could suggest that today the economy for the middle class is anywhere near where it used to be is beyond comprehension, I think, to the vast majority of the American people. The reality that we're seeing today is that the middle class in this country is disappearing. Median family income is going down. We have more people living in poverty today than any time in the history of the United States of America. And as Secretary Reich pointed out, between 2009 and 2012, 95% of all new income generated in this country went to the top 1%. And in terms of wealth, the situation is even worse. Maybe some of the panelists might want to defend the situation where the top 1% in America owns more wealth than the bottom, that the top 1% owns 38% of the wealth in this country, and the bottom 60% owns 2.3% of the wealth. Does anybody on that panel, and I will ask that question in a moment, think that that makes moral sense or economic sense? Does anybody think it makes moral or economic sense that one family, the Walton family, owns more wealth than the bottom 40% of the American people? Now, in terms of government action, we have heard that the stimulus package presumably had no impact. Well, that wasn't true in my state, nor was it true in America. By investing in our economy, in our kids, in infrastructure. According to the CBO, the Recovery Act, the stimulus bill, created or sustained up to 3.6 million jobs, a 4.2% boost for GDP in the first quarter of 2010, and a reduction in the unemployment rate of up to 2.1% in the last quarter of 2009, at a time we needed the jobs the most. Last point that I want to make, and I want to ask a question on this one. The Walton family is the wealthiest family in America. Does anybody on the panel think that they need significant welfare help? And yet it turns out that they are the largest recipient of welfare in America. Because when you pay workers starvation wages, which is what Walmart does, how do the workers at Walmart or McDonald's or Burger King survive? Well, they get Medicaid for their kids and for themselves. They get food stamps. They live in government-sponsored affordable housing. So I start off with my question to Dr. Winship, and we'll go down the line. Do you think the Walton family, worth $100 billion, is in need of welfare from the middle class of this country? Or do you think maybe we should raise the minimum wage so that those workers can earn a living wage and not have to get Medicaid or food stamps? Dr. Winship?
Thank you, Senator. So let me start with your earlier question about defending the wealth distribution that we have. So
well, actually, my question was on the Walton family. Do you think they need welfare?
So I would not use the word welfare. I think it's stigmatizing.
You think their workers, in large numbers, should have to get Medicaid or food stamps?
What I think is that Walmart has the low prices, which...
Please answer my question.
So I'm sorry, repeat the question for me.
The question is, do you think the wealthiest family in this country, the Walton family, should have employees, large numbers of employees, who depend upon government help, Medicaid, food stamps, affordable housing, in order to get by, or should they pay their workers a living wage, and should we raise the minimum wage to make sure that they do that?
I think that we should not raise the wage above levels that's going to cause Walmart to not hire their workers. The only way that they're able to have the prices which benefit low-income people more than people up on the income distribution is by paying wages that are not as high as you or I might like.
So I'm hearing your question to be that the middle class of this country, through increased taxes, should be subsidizing the wealthiest family in this country who are paying inadequate wages. Secretary Reich, what's your take on that?
When Walmart came to Washington, D.C., the number of job applicants per job, there were more than dozens of people willing to take each job. I think Walmart is a brilliant innovation, and I have no beef with the Walton family. It would be great if people could move up the wage distribution faster at Walmart and aspire to management positions and better positions for themselves and their children.
Okay, thank you. Next, Mr. Campbell.